All right, good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be able to participate in this very exciting panel we have this morning with four extremely distinguished speakers. My name is Jennifer Hadden. I am a professor of international relations at the University of Maryland and a fellow with the Council of Foreign Relations working here at the State Department on climate issues. As I mentioned this morning, we have four speakers who will each be able to highlight different critical components of the administration's action on climate change, particularly related to providing an overview of the science, but also the international domestic policies associated with acting on climate change. And in particular, I'm hoping that each of the speakers will attempt to make connections to the issues that I know are particularly of interest to this community, including climate adaptation, community resilience, environmental justice, and of course promoting access to clean and affordable energy. So these are the issues that I hope that we will deal with this morning. Our goal, because we're running a little bit late on time, is to have each of the speakers provide a brief overview and then to allow time for Q&A, because I'm sure that you have many questions that you'd like to pose to these representatives. So if we could begin perhaps by allowing Tom to provide us with an overview of the science and sort of frame our conversation by telling us what we know right now about monitoring climate change and what the implications are for adaptation planning. Thanks, Tom.
We a little bit behind on time?
A little bit, so okay. 5 minutes or so.
So I'm Tom Wagner. I'm the cryosphere program scientist at NASA headquarters, which means I'm the person in charge of most of the polar research, sea level rise, those kinds of things. And one of the neat things that we've been doing in the last couple of years is using radar from satellites to actually map how fast the ice sheet is flowing into the ocean. It's pretty relevant for climate change for a couple of reasons. You know, the first thing is that sea level rise is one of the most obvious things that it's one of the most tangible, obvious, important things that's going to happen as the planet warms up. But I kind of also try to get people to realize that some of the things that are happening right now today because of global warming, and we literally can measure them the same way that you measure the oil in your car, like a dipstick, you know. In the case of Greenland, one of the things we can do is we go and there's a satellite with radar on it, flies over the ice sheet, takes a picture, then takes another picture, compares the two pictures, and from that you can map how fast the ice flowed. And just, oh good, it's gonna loop. Yeah, there we go. So what you're looking at here is the island of Greenland, right? There's something literally like 20 feet of sea level rise. Like picture this, right? There's so much ice there that if it all melted and you went out to the beach, sea level would be like 20 feet higher, okay? It's miles thick, a mile thick in places. In Antarctica, you have a lot more ice, more like you could raise sea levels by like 180 feet. So what we do is everything from go and drill holes in it to go and mapping the surfaces. And what you're looking at here are literally how the rivers of ice flow from the center of Greenland out to the coast. And the way that it works, you can almost think of it like pouring honey on the table. You know, if you just took a big bottle of honey the way that my 3-year-old likes to do, and pour it all in the middle of the table, it'll build up into a pile, and then that pile will flow out to the sides. Well, it's the same thing with snow in Greenland. The snow will build up in the middle. It gets so heavy, it compresses into ice. And then that ice literally just flows, even in solid state. In some places, it flows so fast, it flows like 90 feet a day. You can sit there and you can, 2 minutes? Let's go. You can hear it going by. You can see it going by. That's how fast it goes. One of the things I want to point out, so the blue areas and the red areas are places where it's flowing a lot faster. One of the reasons that's happening is that as the ocean's warming up, it's causing the front of the ice to calve away more quickly and allowing the ice behind it to flow a lot more quickly into the ocean. One of the scary things for us about Greenland is that it's looked like it's been speeding up in the past 10 years, and also the colder northern part has started to lose ice too. But again, as I pointed out earlier, right, sea level's rising around the world right now. I had a very uncomfortable moment when I was on CNN one morning with an anchor who wasn't really prepared and had just come off this political story, and it was actually Candy Crawford. She goes, "Wait, sea level's really rising? You mean like people are going to lose their houses?" You know, and it was like, oh, we're on national TV. But like today, you know, you can go out. It's really happening. The city of Miami's getting flooded. There's streets in Brooklyn, apparently, where they tell people not to park during high tides. This is just showing the sea level rise over the last century. It's about 3 millimeters a year. Places like sea level's a little bit variable around the world, how fast it goes up. New York has seen about 1 foot of sea level rise, and that's one of the reasons the hurricane's impact was greater. So kind of cutting to the chase, right? In the coming century, we could see anywhere from 1 to, say, 5 feet of sea level rise. A meter or 3 feet or so of sea level rise would displace about 145 million people. When I think about something like Syria, which internationally displaced about 3 million people, you look at the chaos that caused and the tragic humanitarian impact, and I start to go, whoa, 145 million people. And that's just from sea level rise, right? And granted, it will be more of a gradual process, but what we'll see is a continuous flux of people out of these areas from around the globe. The red is showing you where the areas of the impact. No surprise, where are our most economically important areas? Where do people live? They live in coastal areas. That's where our ports are. That's where our major cities are. And poor people live in low-lying areas around the world where they make their livings through fishing and those kinds of things. But also, too, the other thing is that as these people are displaced, they're also going to lose their ways of earning a living. You know, it's going to be a huge impact. This is a very, very crude calculation from the Stern report a few years ago, but we're talking about $1 trillion in lost GDP, you know, from these people as they move. And just really quickly, these are the major cities around the U.S. New York's in the lower right. New Orleans is in the upper left. The Chesapeake Bay is in there too. This is going to really impact us here in the U.S. Okay, so and like I say, understand it's already happening now. I've read stats that something like half of most of like the housing development that's done in the U.S. in the last 20 years is all in coastal areas. A lot of those communities were planned without any thought for sea level rise. The Greenland movie I showed you. Hey, just as my last slide. So this is the actual sea level rise projections from the last IPCC report. The vertical axis is sea level rise in meters. The horizontal axis is time, and 2100, a century, less than a century from now, is all the way on the right. The red bars at the top, what you should understand about this is that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? This thing says, hey, we could get anywhere from 1 to 3 feet. One of the problems, though, is that in these IPCC models, which are amazing, they blend everything from an economic model through to how much CO2 is going to go to the atmosphere, translate that through to temperature, and then they translate that through to how fast the ice is going to flow into the ocean or how fast it's going to melt in some parts of the world. The problem is this: some of the most dynamic processes we're just beginning to get a handle on. How fast does ice calve into the ocean? How does it break apart literally? What will the changes be in the balance of snow that falls versus rain and things like that? What scares us is that when we look to the geologic record, there are times when sea level has risen by 10 feet in 100 years, okay? Tremendous amounts. And so we go, okay, we know that our models are limited. Is this the kind of thing that we can expect? So what I try to tell people is this. Our best models tell us anywhere from 1 to 3 feet. The problem is this is a rapidly evolving field, and now we're scared more about 5 feet. Okay, what does that mean for all of us? What's the take-home point, right? It's time for us to kind of shift our thinking on climate change in a couple of ways. The first thing is, one, there's change happening right now, and we need to plan for that change. That means we need to think a lot about risk assessment. If you are building a nuclear power plant where you have very, very low tolerance for risk, you need to think, whoa, 5 feet of sea level rise is the kind of thing I got to worry about. As you're building new if you're building a vacation home on the beach, you can probably tolerate more risk, and it's okay. All right, but we also need people to understand this when they're making those decisions. I can tell you the insurance industry is already worried about these kinds of things. But then the other thing, as Secretary Momentous was talking about, we really need to think about the long term and the planet that we're leaving behind to people. And we certainly need to worry about, hey, what's 2150 going to look like and those things. And we can actually, through curbing CO2, have a big impact on things like sea level rise and the future of the planet. That's it. Thank you very much, and I'll go back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. As Tom highlighted, sea level rise and other effects of climate change have obvious implications both domestically and internationally. I'm hoping now we can pivot to Leo Martinez-Diaz to give us a little bit of an overview of his work as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Environment at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And his work particularly involves U.S. investments in multilateral financial mechanisms supporting environmental goals, especially global climate change. So perhaps he can tell us a little bit about his work in the area of climate finance and how it connects to planning for adaptation and mitigation. Yeah, I think if you can come up here.
Thanks so much. And thank you for the invitation to be here and to share some thoughts with you. My job is to talk about the money. I am from the Treasury, after all. The technologies that the Secretary just talked to you about and some of the adaptation to climate change that we've been discussing here, including to sea level rise, is going to require financing. There's no question about that. In 2009, developed countries made a commitment in Copenhagen that we would provide to developing countries $100 billion per year by 2020. Now, that is not just public money. That includes private financing. It includes financing from multilateral institutions as well as bilateral. So a whole array of tools for mobilizing financing to help developing countries both lower their carbon emissions as well as adapt to the impacts of climate change. Just 2 months ago, a report was released trying to tally up, well, where are we today in relation to that $100 billion per year goal by 2020. And what came back was pretty good news. We're about 2/3 of the way. That is $62 billion has been mobilized as of last year, 2014. And we are, of course, 5 years away still. So that is a very positive message that I want to leave you with here, is that we are mobilizing financing. That financing goes through things like the World Bank, multilateral public institutions. It goes through USAID and our bilateral aid agencies. And that money is, in many cases, leveraging private capital that would not otherwise go into the technologies that Secretary Moniz talked about if it wasn't for some assistance from the public sector. So we are moving money in large scale, but there is still more that needs to be done. And that is what I'd like to talk to you about briefly here. One of those components for mobilizing money is the Green Climate Fund. I understand you're going to have a breakout session later today on it, so let me just give you some of the basics about this fund. This fund was created under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And its main goal is to direct some of that $100 billion, not all of it by any means, but some part of that, to developing countries in order to help them reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change. Now, one of the key things that is worth noting is that this fund is only to work in developing countries, and it will be financed primarily by contributions from developed countries, including the US. As of today, about $10.2 billion has been pledged by countries to that fund. About 60% of that has now been signed into formal commitments with the fund. So we're well on our way to making good on the $10 billion. About half of that money is going to go to mitigation, that is to helping countries lower their emissions through solar and wind and many other technologies. The other half is going to go to help developing countries manage some of the worst impacts of climate change. And that's important because at least half of that money, the adaptation money, at least half of that is going to be earmarked for the least developed countries, for African countries, and for the so-called small island developing states. That is the communities that are going to hurt the most, the communities that are on the front line of climate change. Now, very quickly, I'll tell you what the fund is and what it isn't, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I want you to have the facts at your disposal. What it isn't, first, it is not part of the UN. It was set up under the auspices of the UNFCCC, but it is not staffed by the UN. It is not funded by the UN. We have worked very hard to ensure that this fund will make its own financial decisions separate from the UN. And that's important to many folks in terms of accountability to the contributors. Second, it is not a large bureaucracy with large overheads and lots of our money going to support thousands of people in some international building. Rather, it is a very lean, and I mean very lean, staffing pattern. It is meant to work through the entities that already exist. So it is actually not replicating capacity. It is actually just working through other institutions. And that's good for us because it means lower overheads. It means more of the money goes to the people who need it and less goes into intermediaries. It is not going to displace aid going to education and health. This is something that has been in the press lately. What the fund is going to do is it looks at the climate impact of its investments, but it also looks at so-called co-benefits. It looks to what extent are these investments also going to help generate economic growth and improve health and other aspects of development. It is not a zero-sum game. They're actually totally complementary, because you cannot have development, you cannot have health and education and economic growth if you also have sea level rise and displaced communities and destroyed crops. And finally, it is not an opaque institution. We have worked very hard to make sure that the fund is going to be the kind of place where the U.S. government is comfortable putting U.S. taxpayer money. It has all the board documents are publicly available. All the board meetings are broadcast and put on the web. There's over 100 accredited observers who travel to witness all of the board meetings. There are civil society organizations who actually sit at the board as active observers. There's an integrity unit that is in charge of investigating any allegations of corruption, of misuse of funds. There's an evaluation unit that is independent of the fund that will evaluate the impact of these investments. And so there's a whole set of controls and tools that will help make sure that the money is going to those who need it most. What is the fund? It is the largest fund for adaptation that we've ever created. If you take half of the $10 billion, that's a $5 billion fund, roughly, that will go help some of the poorest and most vulnerable. It is building on the lessons from the last administration. The Bush administration created the climate investment funds. Few people know this, but this was a very important contribution they made. $2 billion commitment made by the Bush administration, and we have taken a lot of the lessons from that set of funds in designing the Green Climate Fund. It is a cost-effective way to advance our priorities, because the Green Climate Fund allows us to leverage money both from other countries who are putting contributions in because the U.S. is doing so, and it helps us leverage money from the private sector and from other actors who also are able to invest and mobilize financing because they have access to public finance from the U.S. and other donors. And finally, it is a fund that will work through local institutions in many instances, high-quality institutions in developing countries. One of the key criticisms, as you know, is that a lot of aid flows directly through developed country institutions and doesn't create any capacity in the countries. And so once you leave, there is nothing left there to help long term. What the fund will do is it will work directly with institutions in those countries to make sure that they can channel not just GCF money more effectively, but also their own money as well. What will the fund do? Before I used to give these kinds of talks to audiences such as yourselves, and we didn't really know what the fund would do. We had plans, we had ideas, we had proposals. But we now have the first set of proposals approved by the board just on Friday of last week. 8 proposals in the first batch. This is only a small sample of what eventually the fund will do. But there's some very specific and concrete examples there of what the fund is doing now. For example, it will invest in Malawi, assisting that country and farmers and fishermen to use climate information that will help them preempt some of the worst impacts of weather and will help them take precautions through an early warning system. In Rwanda and Kenya, we're going to help sustain small and medium-sized enterprises that are investing in off-grid solar for communities who do not have access to electricity, are not connected to the grid, and will now have an opportunity not just to have electricity, but to have zero emissions electricity. In Bangladesh, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to sea level rise and other impacts, the fund will help mainstream climate information and climate resilience into infrastructure. That means building more resilient bridges and schools and shelters that will help that community withstand some of these storms and extreme climate events. And in Peru, the fund will help communities, including indigenous communities, better manage the forest so that we are protecting not just the carbon sink capacity of the forest, but we're also protecting the peatlands that underlie those forests from burning up and putting more carbon into the atmosphere. There's more examples. I invite you to look at the website and look at the actual projects, and I think you'll get a better sense of what actually is happening. And then lastly, just to close, we cannot do this if we do not deliver on our pledge. The U.S. has a $3 billion pledge of the $10 billion, 30%. We are the largest contributor or pledger to the fund. The world is looking to us to deliver on this pledge. The President's budget for 2016 includes $500 million for the GCF. That's the first installment of our pledge. And it is absolutely crucial that we're able to deliver, not just because of the money, but because it shows the leadership that the U.S. is intending to bring to climate finance in general. We're working with Congress during the budget cycle right now to ensure that we can have money for the GCF. Finally, I'd like to close by saying that in this area, we can make a difference because the U.S. has done it before. You'll recall that, some years ago, the U.S. and its financial resources helped turn the tide of HIV/AIDS in Africa through a very concerted and focused effort of getting technology and finance to be channeled to those communities that needed it. We have done the same in terms of post-disaster relief and reconstruction. The U.S. is seen as a leader every time there's a major earthquake, a storm, a famine. We're always there, we're efficient, we can deliver. And the world is looking to us now to make sure that the Green Climate Fund is able to do the same and to deliver for those who need this assistance most. I wish you the best in terms of the breakout session, which my colleague Rick Noguera will chair, and to please be informed and to share this information with those in your community who care about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very helpful overview of the Green Climate Fund. And building on this connection between climate, energy, and development, I'm very pleased to welcome Griffin Thompson from who's the director of the Office of Electricity and Energy Efficiency here at the State Department. Griffin has extensive climate negotiation experience, especially concerning issues of energy and technology. And I'm hoping that he'll be able to help us elaborate on the role of technology in promoting energy access and also this energy innovation agenda that we've spoken about earlier. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As was just stated, I direct the Office of Electricity and Energy Efficiency here in the State Department in our Bureau of Energy Resources. But I'm also an adjunct professor at Georgetown, where I teach 2 different classes on energy, one in the School of Foreign Service and one in the McCourt School of Public Policy, as well as a class on ethics in the McCourt School of Public Policy. So it's rewarding to see another collaboration between the State Department and Georgetown. In fact, we had a similar collaboration just a couple of weeks ago when Georgetown hosted some of the sessions for our Secretary of State's Investment Forum on climate and energy. So we're starting to understand and very much appreciate the vitality and the need to reach out to Catholic universities, all universities, and other elements of the faithful community. So what I want to do here in the next few minutes is explain a little bit of what we do in the Energy Bureau here at the State Department as we try to change the rhetoric of climate into the reality of actual projects on the ground. And given the theme of today's workshop, I want to place our work very humbly within the broad context of Pope Francis's recent hallmark encyclical, Laudato Si. So what is it that the Energy Bureau does? Well, we work at all levels of the spheres of authority, from the village to multilaterals, private sector and other governments, to transform the energy economies around the world. Secretary Moniz has earlier stated we are in the middle of an energy revolution as we're moving from high carbon to low and zero carbon energy economies. Our job in the State Department is to integrate energy issues, energy policy, into the broader complex of our foreign policy. So our goal is to ensure 21st century energy security for our country and countries around the world. Our job and mission is to extend access to clean energy services to those who are currently deprived and suffering high levels of energy poverty around the world. as well as to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the process. So what we do is focus on a couple fundamental things. Secretary Moniz talked about the need for innovation, and he's absolutely right. But what we do and what we have found in country after country after country is the absolute need of addressing the institutions in those countries that are required to help catalyze energy transitions. In fact, Pope Francis talked about the importance and the role of effective institutions in the section of the encyclical called Integral Ecology. And he underscored the absolute vitality, or the need for the vitality of institutions, how current institutions jeopardize the welfare not only of the planet, but of the human welfare of the populations. So, and we agree. We agree that institution reform is front and center. And that the point is we have technologies that are cost-effective, low-carbon right now. They aren't being diffused. They aren't being used because of a variety of inefficiencies of institutions, financial, policy, regulatory. And that's what we do in our bilateral relationships, in many of our plurilateral and multilateral work. We work to change the rules of the game, because the rules of the game that are currently in place were designed to accommodate fossil fuel energy technologies. Policies and regulations that are required to diffuse and adopt renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies are different. And so our job is to make that transition. We in the West too often have a tendency to fixate on the hardware. We all seem to be enamored with the next technological fix, whether it's in energy, whether it's in health, whether it's in transportation, whatever it is, we keep looking for the new shiny machine. And Pope Francis talks about this in the encyclical when he writes, "Many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society." You know, first of all, you got to love a pope who talks about epistemological paradigms. And so he's quite right. We have plenty of gadgets, we have plenty of widgets, we have plenty of technical artifacts. They aren't being used. And again, this is not to say we don't need more technological innovation. Secretary Moniz is absolutely right. You looked at those numbers that he spoke of regarding cost reductions. That comes through from basic R&D. But again, you look at solar PV, the highest cost right now for a solar PV panel is not the hardware cost, it's the software cost, it's the licensing, it's the technical assistance, it's everything that surrounds that which needs to move. And so we, within the Energy Bureau, working with the Department of Energy, working with others, look at the institutional scaffolding, the social scaffolding that is required to usher in this new age of energy, low energy technologies. As was mentioned, before coming to the Energy Bureau earlier this year, I spent a number of years in the Climate Change Office here in the State Department, where I managed all the climate change programs that are funded by the State Department. We have over $500 million of projects in the pipeline, and I also led the negotiations on technology within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for a number of years. And both the programs that we implement and the negotiations that we lead on technology, what we continually talked about, again, was not the hardware. It was about changing the institutions, fix the policy and regulatory structures, and guess what? The money that Leo Martinez is talking about will find you. Create business environments which will encourage investment. The money will find you. A good friend of mine runs environmental finance at Citibank, and he keeps telling me, Griff, just fix the institutions. If these guys fix the institutions, I guarantee you our bank and other banks will find our way to invest in that country. So it's not so much the magic bullet that we're seeing. In fact, the father of distributed generation many years ago, Carl Weinberg, said there is no magic bullet, just magic buckshot. And so we're pursuing the buckshot philosophy. And so finally, so where do we work? Well, we work, again, as I mentioned, we look at all spatial spheres of authority from multilateral UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to the neighborhoods, municipalities, countries, states, provinces. And in fact, what we do is actualize one of the central tenets of Catholic social thought, which is the principle of subsidiarity. Now, I know this erudite crowd knows precisely where that principle was first articulated within the Catholic Church, and that was in Pope Pius XI's papal encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, where he states that the default position of action ought to be at the lowest level possible. But the lowest level possible is dependent upon the nature of the actions. At some times, that's the household. At other times, it's the central government. At other cases, it's the international level. So I find that the programmatic eloquence and elegance of that concept is found in its operational elasticity. And so that's what we do. We work at all levels of authority depending upon the nature of the action. And in particular, this department, my bureau, my office, and this government is spending more and more time looking at the cities. Because cities have perennially been the incubators of innovation and the cradles of creativity. And we are understanding from the foreign policy perspective that we need to spend more time with subnational local authorities. Because it's the cities that are way out in front in terms of providing innovation in policies, projects, and programs. And again, finally, Pope Pius draws our attention to the plight of cities when he says, quote, "We are conscious of the disproportionate and unruly growth of many cities, which have become unhealthy to live in, not only because of pollution caused by toxic emissions, but also as a result of urban chaos, poor transportation, and visual pollution and noise. Many cities are huge, inefficient structures, excessively wasteful of energy and water." And so one of the primary pillars of my office's new strategy is to look at that energy-water nexus, particularly as that nexus manifests itself at the urban level. And we have a number of initiatives at the subnational level with India and China. We, at the national level, working with Leo's office as well as the Special Envoy's Office for Climate Change, Rick Noguera, the Department of Energy, OPIC, Exim, on a U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force that my bureau's Special Envoy, Amos Hochstein, leads with Minister Goyal in India, looking at how do we change the institutions? What are the lessons that we have in the United States in terms of how we catalyzed our domestic market for renewable energy? And what are those lessons? Which of those can be applied in India? As Aristotle said many centuries ago, people move to cities to live. People stay in cities to live well. And in this day and age, living well in a city means a city that's resilient and fueled by low-carbon technologies. The work ahead is not going to be easy. Individuals and institutions act habitually, and habits are very difficult to change. Ask anybody in March how their New Year's resolution is going. But it's the habits that we are changing. We are trying to break the old habits of fossil fuel energy use, and it's those habits that we will continue to move beyond Paris. So our work in the Energy Bureau coming out of Paris is the same work we're doing going into Paris. That is, transform institutions, move countries, cities, provinces, and states towards a low-carbon energy technology. And in fact, what we do and are doing in our work plan is conforming to one of the Jesuits' enduring exhortations, which is age quod ages. Do what you're doing. But I think in our case, we need to do it quicker and bigger. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that. In our final presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about domestic policy for tackling climate change. And I'm very pleased to welcome Mustafa Ali, who is the Senior Advisor to the Administration for Environmental Justice at EPA. And Mustafa is going to provide an overview of domestic policy related to the Clean Power Plan, particularly as relates to the themes of environmental justice that I know this community is particularly interested in. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, my goodness. State Department needs to give up on some Krispy Kreme donuts, don't they? All right, let's try it again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Mustafa Santiago Ali, and I was raised in the Baptist and Pentecostal church. in a family full of ministers and deacons and deaconesses. So when folks told me that I had 5 to 7 minutes to speak, for those of you who have spent some time in our church, you understand we take that much time just to say good morning and introduce folks. But being blessed and raised with the parents that I've been, they instilled some things in my brothers and sisters that go along with some of the things that we're talking about here today. They told me and taught me about how important it is for us to be stewards of the earth, but also the importance that we make sure that for our brothers and sisters that we have a responsibility to those who are less fortunate, who are those individuals who are in vulnerable communities, in overburdened communities, and how all of the things that we are talking about today, and my esteemed colleagues have been referencing, have an impact. Everything is connected. So as I'm traveling around the country, and I'm probably given over 1,000 presentations now, I was actually raised and came up in the environmental justice movement. I think it's always very important, if we expect everyday people to be able to connect with these very technical issues that we speak about sometimes, to just keep it simple, to make sure that it's basic. So I usually ask folks a question. How many folks in the room consider themselves environmentalists? And in this room, we have a few more than I normally see. But I do a couple of things that tie all this together. I ask people by a show of hands, how many people in the room have taken a fresh breath of air today? Show your hands. Everybody look around. That's an important but simple question, because we have individuals who are in this country and around the world who don't necessarily have that ability. They say that on a daily basis, that we take between 17,000 and 30 breaths a day. Now imagine if you couldn't do that. And that's why it's so important on the work that we do around climate. By a show of hands, in the last 24 hours, how many folks in the room have been able to take a drink of water? I want to see the first, everybody look around, because I want to see the people who've never drank any water. We need to know who those folks are. But again, it's that simple, that the work that we do gives people the opportunity to be able to do that. But there still are far too many people who don't necessarily have that opportunity. And if we don't address the impacts from climate change, as you've heard from my colleagues and others, the opportunity for those basic things to happen will become less and less. And individuals will have to deal with the challenges that exist in that. Now, we talk about climate change, we talk about the impacts, we talk about, temperatures rising. But in my work over the last 20 years, and it's really helped me to better inform the policy that I work on, the majority of it has been outside of the Beltway. Great thinkers. How many people know we have great thinkers in Washington, D.C. inside the Beltway? Okay, we have 2 people who believe there are great thinkers in Washington, D.C. But for me, if the voice of communities is not influencing the policy that we develop, the activities and the programs, then there is a missing component to the work that we do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think about when people say climate change is not real, the times that I've spent in Alaska with Native Alaskans, and them talking about the changes that they've seen in their respective communities, over the last couple of decades. But lots of times folks are so far removed from the individuals who are there that they don't understand the connection of why this work is so important. Or I think about the work that I've done along the Gulf Coast and the intensity of the storms that are there, and the individuals who are already dealing with a myriad of issues, and now we're talking about overlaying it with climate change. So those impacts are doubly important that we make sure that we're focused on those. Or if you look at Native American folks who are here, who have culture that is connected to the land. And when fish stocks start to change, that changes the culture. When we look at some of the indigenous plants that individuals use, and those may no longer be there because of droughts, then there is a connection to culture, and it changes the dynamics of the individuals. So I try and make sure that people understand that when we talk about climate change and I talk about climate justice, we are talking about real people with real impacts. And now we're making it even more significant because of the changes that are coming and are here with climate change. So I promised that I would be brief. because there's plenty of time for us to go into some greater detail on some of these things. But I wanted to talk about some of the things. First of all, the president has done a fantastic job in helping cars to go further on a gallon of gas. And again, everything's connected. So when we can do that, there's less impacts that are happening inside of low-income and vulnerable communities. The commitment that exists now around wind, I believe since the president came in, now we have 3 times more wind that's being used, 20 times more solar that's being used. And lots of times people will see the basic aspects of that now we're using renewable fuels, but they're not thinking about the connection that when we use fossil fuels, where the pollution goes and who's being impacted by it. So you have to make those connections if you want everyday people. I've spent plenty of time on the porches with Mr. Johnson or in the kitchens with Mrs. Ramirez. And when you simplify this so that they understand how it is beneficial to their lives, then they get it. Then there are champions for these issues. So I share that with folks as we move forward. And the Clean Power Plan is a prime example of how making sure that the voice of a multitude of stakeholders is a part of that process. So the important part, of course, is that by 2030, we'll have a 30% reduction in carbon, 30% plus reduction in carbon. But the more important thing is that the voice of everyday citizens help to inform that policy. I think we got millions and millions of comments. There were hundreds of workshops that were done around the country helping people to understand what could be a part of the process, but also that their voice mattered. So, being brief, I will say this. Moving forward to Paris provides a transformational opportunity, not only to make sure that we're getting those targets and reductions and commitments from a multitude of countries, but also that the voice of everyday people, of communities, of our most vulnerable and impacted communities has to be a part of our process. When we talk about innovation, we need to also be asking ourselves, how do we make sure that those who have dealt with the challenges can also be a strong partner in the benefits that will also come from a climate economy? So I want to thank you all for giving me a few moments, and everyone have a blessed day.
All right, well, thank you so much for your comments on that topic. At this point, we'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. If you do have questions, if you could go to the microphones that we have assembled here in the aisle, that would be wonderful. We'd also ask you to identify yourself and the organization that you're here with today so that our speakers have a sense of where you're coming from. So if there are questions, please step up to the mic.
Well, let me just start the ball rolling a little bit. I'm Michael Hamburger with the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, and I'm thinking particularly perhaps a question for Tom and Griffin. We've talked a little bit about the science and technological aspects of addressing climate change issues, and I'm wondering if you can comment on the ways in which we're sharing not only the technologies and the approaches, but also the scientific expertise and the technological expertise to the most vulnerable countries. In what ways are we doing technology transfer and educational transfer to those developing countries?
Sure, thank you, Michael. That's a very good question. As I mentioned, in this administration, under the Global Climate Change Initiative, we have a tremendous amount of funding, I mean, tremendous, relatively speaking, close to $500 million in the pipeline, which we work with Treasury and a number of other federal agencies in 3 different pillars of global climate change, which is adaptation, mitigation, and land use and forestry. And some of the representative activities that we do is provide technical assistance. Oftentimes it's the other countries that simply don't have the capacity to understand what is the science of the argument and what are the technologies that are required to either respond to the adaptation challenge or the mitigation challenge. And again, we do this bilaterally. We send money to the Department of Energy, EPA, USDA. We've also established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change a Climate Technology Center and Network. The U.S. was one of the principal architects of that center. It is operated by the UN Environmental Program, and it is supposed to be a one-stop shop for developing countries to submit requests on how do they implement the technology roadmap, the climate technology roadmap that many of them have developed. That is basic questions on what are building codes, what is a feed-in tariff for renewable energy, or how do we get assistance. And so we, through the center, we have a vast network of private and public sector and international organizations that will provide assistance to the developing countries on specific climate technology mitigation and adaptation. That is in addition to all the work that USAID is doing, our export credit agencies, and the rest of the programs that we are funding under the Global Climate Change Initiative. But it's essentially getting technical assistance and experts out into the field and helping build the capacity in the countries so they can make their own sovereign decisions.
So a couple of things. One, NASA, and I think it's with support of USAID, as a matter of fact, has a program called SERVIR, S-E-R-V-I-R, which makes satellite data available in developing countries. There's like a SERVIR Africa and also one for high mountain Asia in Nepal. All the NASA data, and this goes for most of the federal agencies that do this kind of work, like NSF and DOE and others, that data is all freely available. NASA's got something like 16 or 17 satellites on orbit around the Earth right now, more being launched all the time. Things like the Orbital Carboning Observatory, which looks at the CO2 sources and sinks. And all that data is freely available. Unfortunately, it's not true in the international setting. Other countries have more complicated space programs that are public-private partnerships, so it's not always available. One thing I want to talk about, though, too, is kind of as we go forward, technology is changing pretty rapidly. Some of the things you may be hearing about now are CubeSats, these tiny satellites that are like 6 inches on a side. You can link them together to make even bigger ones. Apparently, the private sector, especially in response to climate change, is doing things like funding the companies to develop those so they can get better real-time information around the globe to do things like corn futures pricings and things like that. But there are some real opportunities to do a better job. One of the things that people that work in Africa had said to me is that, like, local farmers are starting to say, okay, look, we know about these big cycles on the planet, like take like El Nino affects us here. What are the crops that we should plant this year? You know, like what's it? And we're starting to do better with our kind of forecasts on that kind of yearly level. So kind of going forward, I think some of the big Earth system modeling, which a number of government agencies are funding, is probably going to change the way that we do things like plant and also the kinds of advice that we can give people in developing countries.
Sure. My name is Seamus Finn. I actually chair the board of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and thanks very much for your presentations. But a few thoughts that I would welcome your comments on. I think one is the public-private partnership conversation. I think there are a number of faith communities that are under a lot of pressure on the divestment side, on the fossil fuel-free campaign. That creates a certain challenge. And I guess at the same time, there's a certain nervousness also in the civil society, faith community, NGO sector about anything that starts with public-private partnerships. And so that's, I think, one piece of it that I think is of concern, and how you all see that from your perspective. I think the second thing I wanted to comment on is, on the one hand, there's the very positive exhortation, what the faith communities can do on the climate change issue. I sometimes find it to be a bit simply, maybe utilitarian is the wrong word, but it's a bit more on the moral imperative side. And I think the faith communities could also be challenged, I think, in terms of their relationship with science and scientific discovery. And I think the more ritual, the more theoretical, you know, what is the future and where are we going, and how are they preaching about that? So I think you're preaching a very positive viewpoint in terms of what science can do. Religion hasn't always been friendly with science, and I think we all know that, whether it's in discovery in very small areas or large areas. So any comments on either of those, I'd be happy to hear.
I think one for you.
Well, I'll take the latter, and history is a good example of how faith has played a strong role in the environmental justice movement, at least. The United Church of Christ and Commission for Racial Justice, under a report that was done in 1987 by Charles Lee, actually helped to build some of the foundational elements of the environmental justice movement in the report that they did, which showed that the placing of some of these polluting facilities were in low-income and communities of color. Also, over the last 30 years of the environmental justice and climate justice movement now, faith institutions have been front and center on a number of the issues. If you go back to Warren County, North Carolina, the flashpoint for the environmental justice movement, it was ministers, along with community residents and others who were right there marching, fighting the siting of the PCB landfill in that small community, African-American community, actually. And throughout the work of the Environmental Protection Agency, the faith community, whether it's as a part of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council or a number of other entities that exist inside of the agency, have been members, have been influencers, and sharing their expertise and knowledge along the way. So I share that to say that faith institutions and individuals have played a significant role in sharing along with a multitude of other stakeholders as well.
I can jump in on the public-private partnership point. Look, given the scale of the challenge, there is no way that public funding alone is going to help meet the needs, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. So the real challenge for us is how do we engage the private sector and private capital in general in terms of focusing and channeling their resources in areas that will be long-term low carbon, and to do it not just as corporate social responsibility, important, but in order to have real scale, you need to engage them on a commercial basis. In other words, they need to be able to make money. And the question is, how can they do that, and how do we structure partnership so that they will actually make available their resources? And so the example I gave, for example, of the Green Climate Fund, helping and enabling private companies in Rwanda and Kenya to provide off-grid solar to some of the poorest communities there, is an example of how you can address some of the bottom of the pyramid needs through the private sector with the use of some public money. And by the private sector, we tend to think, of large Fortune 500 firms. But in this case, the private sector is actually local, small and medium-sized companies in Rwanda and Kenya, composed of Rwandan and Kenyan entrepreneurs. So we should think more broadly about what the private sector is, but we need to start with recognition that their resources, their skills, their technology will be required.
My name is Chris Elisara, and I direct the Creation Care Task Force for the World Evangelical Alliance. And strategically, the WEA is connecting COP21 to Habitat 3. The future of sustainability is going to depend on what happens in cities the next decade. So to Habitat 3, what gets planned out there is going to be very important. So I was really appreciative of what you said, Griffin, in terms of cities. So I guess I have a question for you, if you could elaborate perhaps what you're thinking for Habitat 3 to help us, and also put a plug in for perhaps what we're doing here for COP21. Maybe we could do some of that catalyzing of this community with your resources and expertise for Habitat 3 next year. If you want an agenda, I'm putting it on the table.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, there is, Habitat 3 is getting more and more momentum here in the department. We have a special office in our International Organizations Bureau that follows this. And they've been reaching out to a number of different bureaus, each of which may have a piece of the Habitat 3 agenda puzzle to it. And what we've done several weeks ago, my office put together some examples of case studies, best practices, if you will, from the United States for an ongoing compendium of best practices. Because what we find, and I spent a lot of time within the UN negotiations on climate, working to elevate the visibility of mayors and governors around the world. And what we find, and I've gone to a lot of mayors' meetings, and what they keep saying is, listen, one of the things we need to do, given our catalytic role and our ingenuity at the local level, is to make sure that the central government policies and regulations are in alignment with ours, or vice versa. Oftentimes, they are thwarted in what they want to do by national government regulations or policies that either inhibit or, in fact, get in the way. And so President Obama formed the Climate Change Task Force on Adaptation, where he brought together all the federal agencies that are dealing with adaptation, along with key governors and mayors. And the dominant thing that came out of their conversations and their meetings was the search for political alignment. So how do we give examples where the national government policy has been in alignment with the regional, state, provincial, and local, and that is how you can accelerate change. So I think from your perspective, one of the things that would be useful, again, we are constantly being asked to give us examples. Give us examples in the United States of where these things work. We're establishing a subnational urban-to-urban initiative between the U.S. and India, where we hope to start linking governors, mayors and mayors, NGOs, civil society, and businesses. So we need more and more examples because I know they're out there, but we don't have easy access to them.
Thanks. In the interest of time, I think we should take 2 questions at a time and have the panelists respond. So we'll start over here. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentations and for having the Energy Secretary here as well. I'm Jean Wright. I'm an American Baptist clergy and with the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. In terms of religious communities, as you know, many denominations have and support many missions in other parts of the world. And I'm wondering how the Green Climate Fund might be a help to some of these missions in terms of their energy and efficiency. Many that I know of in other countries, particularly in Africa and less developed countries, will use generators for their schools, for the hospitals, et cetera, powered by kerosene. So I'm wondering if funds from the Green Climate Fund might be available to denominations or to the local missions in other countries to support their energy transformation and transition to renewable, sustainable energies.
Catherine Marshall from the Berkley Center at Georgetown. My question follows very directly from that and is addressed to Leo. I wondered how far in the Green Climate Fund discussions there has been any explicit engagement with religious organizations, whether interfaith or individual. And to reveal my hand, I can see a zillion possibilities. For example, Bangladesh is particularly linking even the issues of extremism with the issues of poverty, with the issues of climate change. If we don't deal with the religious dimensions, failure seems ahead. And you could make the same case for Kenya, for Malawi, for many other countries.
Thank you so much, and let me answer both of those. The way the Green Climate Fund works is it operates through 2 sets of intermediaries that are really important. One is the so-called national designated authorities. They're basically the ministries inside each government for each country that receives money. That ministry is in charge of picking up the phone and being the primary source of contact for the Green Climate Fund. And ultimately, they have to sign off on any projects or investments happening in their country. This is part of the whole idea of country ownership. And the other set of people that are really important here are the entities with which the fund operates, so-called accredited entities. They're the people who actually will execute some of the programs on the ground, or will get partners further down the chain to work with them. And so if there's no reason why faith-based community organizations cannot access GCF financing, the key is that they need to do so working closely with both an accredited entity that is already authorized to channel some of the GCF's money, and to do so in close partnership with the government of that country, so that that government is able to sign off on that investment. So there is, in principle, nothing barring the ability of faith-based organizations to benefit from this. And I think in time it will become clear that some of the ideas and networks that you bring are a plus to the GCF community. And Catherine, in terms of the bringing more faith voices into the debate, I think more can be done. Initially, the GCF focused a lot on two sets of communities, the private sector and the CSOs, the civil society organizations, which tended to be, I think, mostly those civil society organizations interested in development and in environmental issues. And to be honest, I don't have the full list in front of me of the 100+ entities that have been accredited to observe the board meetings, but I don't recall very many faith-based organizations on that list. And I think that is a voice that is missing. I think it's a voice that would bring lots of insights into the conversation. And what I'll do is certainly go back and try to see how we can do a better job of reaching out to them. Now, ultimately, I think the most important thing is for those communities, to link back to my earlier response, to do so in their own countries and to start that conversation by going to the people in the government whose job it is to think about the GCF, to reach out to those who are actually already spending GCF money, and to engage with them directly. That's, I think, the most efficient way to do it, rather than to go through all the layers all the way up to the board and so on. But clearly, there's a lot of potential here that is yet to be tapped.
Thank you, Leo. We have time for just two more brief questions, so please go ahead. Yes.
My name is Warren Stone. I'm a rabbi and with the National Religious Coalition on Creation Care. My question also kind of tags on to Catherine Marshall's question. When we speak about the public-private connection in terms of the Green Climate Fund, I propose that we add public, private, and faith-based initiatives. And maybe a comment that calling upon the faith community, the largest constituency in the world, to develop their own programs. In my own community, which is Temple Manuel here in the Washington area, for 8 years we've done microfinancing of low-carbon projects around the world. What was exciting about the Green Climate Fund is calling upon world faith communities to double it, saying, okay, every faith community needs to microfinance projects in Kenya, in Malawi, in Bangladesh, that are small, low-carbon projects that can have a tremendous impact. So again, calling upon us not only as a moral voice, but as a partner as well. Thank you.
I'm Christopher Bender. I'm a Greek Orthodox priest. I'm also the chair of the steering committee, the Orthodox Fellowship of the Transfiguration, which is our pan-Orthodox environmental organization in this country. And my question, I think, is probably directed to Eduardo. When Griffin was talking about work overseas with energy and technology, he said it's not just a question of the hardware, it's also a question of reforming institutions, which can put up tremendous roadblocks to change. And I was wondering, Eduardo, if in your work with environmental justice, in addition to working at the grassroots with the communities where the greatest impacts are felt with regard to environmental injustice, do you also work with institutions and such as local governments and in order to try to change policies that are leaving, for instance, an example is it tends to be that in many cities the bus depots are always located in communities that are the most disadvantaged and leading to much higher asthma rates and things like this.
So my mother will be happy to know that I have a new name. Actually, Eduardo might be better than Santiago. Who knows? But with that being said, the answer to your question is yes. We do a huge amount of work with local governments. We actually have a local government advisory committee, and they actually have an environmental justice work group as a part of the work that they do. And I think it was about 8 or 9 months ago, they actually put together a best practices report that they've shared that's been very instrumental in helping folks to understand how a number of local governments around the country have been addressing the issues that you raised. I will share one additional point. We also do a huge amount of work also with academic institutions and linking those two together in a couple of different ways, actually. And it's interesting that you raised the point around the bus depots, and I'll give you a quick example. We have something called the Community University Partnership Program, which actually a number of minority serving institutions are a part of that program. And the Selma to Montgomery Trail, for many of you who are historians of the Civil Rights Movement, you understand the significance of that piece of the country. Students from Tuskegee University actually got together with the local government and began to design new bus routes and also new bus stops. How does that touch into climate? Well, for these bus stops that are there, they're now utilizing solar to air condition the respective bus stops and to also light those bus stops that are a part of that historic trail. So that's just one example of how when folks come together in a collaborative way and we honor the voices that are a part of a process, that you can make real change on a small level, but as we begin to exponentially grow that out, you know, we can really make a significant change and also put together a new economy that can reach those who often have been forgotten in that process. So thank you for that question.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but please join me right now in thanking our panelists for the wonderful discussion and their presentations.